Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to Breaking Into Data by Promotable. I'm here today with Patrick Hennessey, who is the Senior Director of Enterprise Strategy at Andela. I hope I pronounced that right.
Nailed it.
But thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
I'd love to just kick it off with just like dive right in. Tell me a little bit more about what you do. What's enterprise strategy?
Sure.
Tell me a little bit more about Andelic so that everyone else can learn about this cool company. And if you guys are hiring, then we can point them in your direction.
Definitely. Yeah. So I see strategy as a quantification of a path towards a business objective. And so it's taking an end state. I work specifically within a revenue organization. We're trying to grow our revenue base, and so we're taking an end state of increased revenue and charting a path to get there, and finding out and understanding the multiple funnels that are going to get us there, exit points of those funnels, understanding the levers that we have in order to pull to accommodate for either to optimize parts of the business that are working well, or make up for parts of the business that are not working as well as were planned, and ultimately creating visibility of that to the executive stakeholders at our companies and ultimately the board and shareholders in a way that they have confidence in what we're doing is building a competent and profitable business before we're in trouble and the money's not coming in the bank, right? And so it's identifying that roadmap, creating a consumable product of information for people who are not intimately involved day to day with the business can understand and comprehend. So that's what I see strategy at large, right? And I kind of came into that piece a few years ago, coming from more of a consulting, like a strictly business intelligence, data engineering consulting life, into the more business focused performance metrics life, and really coming to understand that there's a lot of value to be gleaned outside of the technical implementation, right? And taking that technical implementation one step further in a way that creates a consumable piece. And so ultimately, enterprise strategy, specifically refers to our market segmentation. So my boss and I came into a business and started to, in order to build out this segment that was not being specifically targeted before. And so we had an experience in the consulting world previous to this, and are coming in to deliver on a strategy, deliver and execute a strategy in order to reach these ultimate business objectives, 5 and 10 years down the road. So that's kind of maybe a mouthful, but that's what I see strategy and how I kind of see it tie into the underlying data components that support it.
Well, which I think is super important, because we often kind of get sidetracked by like the shiny tools, right? We want to talk about the technical stuff, the fancy data tools, but
that's where the fun is, right?
Exactly. But then like what you're talking about is how we translate that into stuff that actually matters for the business, how we translate that to results. I'm kind of curious, just for whoever ends up listening, when we talk about like stakeholders, who generally are you talking about?
Yeah, so my immediate stakeholders are the vice president of my business unit, the chief revenue officer, and the CEO and the CFO. So these are the people that are ultimately consuming the information and the, like, I'll refer to data products kind of as a generic term of either some sort of data feed that's just feeding a spreadsheet or a dashboard, or like any of those things that are generated from this canonical data engineering, data modeling approach I'm taking. So those people are the day-to-day consumers of these strategy-oriented data products that are coming out. And so it's very high visibility, and it's driving towards the people that are either able to throw more budget at us or take our budget away from us, right? And so it's high visibility, high liability, that we maintain trust and viability in the process that we're promoting.
Got it. Yeah, absolutely. And like what kinds of I suppose what kinds of questions are you guys answering? Like when you make a dashboard or when you're creating metrics for your stakeholders, is it just like adding more users, or is it profitability, or obviously I'm sure a combination, but like what are like the general questions that you get from your stakeholders when you're implementing this strategy?
Yeah, ultimately, like it always starts with, okay, great. Strategy that I've been exposed to
Yeah.
starts with drawing an arbitrary line and saying you're going to get there, right?
Yeah.
And so we look at like revenue, we're like, okay, arbitrarily, we're going to say, here's how we get there.
Yeah.
The question then invariably becomes, how is that going to happen?
Hmm.
And then that's where you create those consumable pieces where we say, okay, if we say we're going to do, arbitrarily, 100x of our revenue in the
Yeah.
next, year, that means that we need to do these things at these points in times in order to get there. And I'm going to, I guess, like I said again, generate credibility in our sense to do that by
Mhm.
showing that we can hit these other paths. And so I think that what I push over and over again to these stakeholders that are consuming these is like, I want them to have less and less hands in the operations of the business,
Mhm.
and trust that because we're hitting these metrics that we're doing what we say we can do, right? So that gives me and my boss more autonomy to direct our business unit in the way that we see fit.
Yeah.
And the only thing that we have to then prove and provide is that we have these conversion rates, or we have these funnel volumes, and these time to close between stages in the funnel. Like ultimately, it's really driving down a funnel and identifying where you have opportunities to add more channels for this funnel or add more outputs of this, right? If there's a different type of consumer for whatever you're producing, right? Whether it be we work in the services organization, right? So um, you know think of us as like sort of on-demand consulting.
Mhm.
In that space, are there more consumers than what we're originally targeting? Are there more types of services that we can provide? Are there different ways we can package these services, right? It's identifying all these different points in a way that, like I said, allows us to, work autonomously and be able to drive. Because that's like where the creativity and the fun in business comes from, is not following someone else's orders, right? It's going through
Yeah.
and understanding, hey, I want to be the entrepreneur here. I want to go do this, and trust me because this, and
Yeah.
treating those stakeholders like your shareholders.
Exactly. You've created these KPIs. I think creating that trust, I think, is a really good way of putting it, because a lot of times when people talk about data, they talk about the stuff you have to do, but the why, I think we don't really articulate well. And the whole reason we have KPIs is that trust factor, and that trust that we're measuring the right things that matter to the business.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I'm going to dive back into
Cool.
something else that you had talked about, kind of in your past role, because I think this is something that for a lot of folks who are new to data science don't quite understand, or all the moving parts that come with it. But tell me about the difference between like data science and data engineering,
Yeah.
because it kind of flows up then to what you're doing now in terms of metrics and KPIs and your funnel.
Yeah, it's funny. So I feel like this question, like, it never satisfies everyone. No matter how you answer it, it's always gonna, set off someone that says that's not correct.
Yeah.
I see, like a lot of people I follow on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
that I kind of respect as either a peer or a remote mentor. Like,
Mhm.
we'll get stuck into that too. Like, no, that's not right. So I'm gonna qualify this answer by saying this is the best I see it.
Yeah.
And
I
and
mean, I don't think
and
there's any ever one perfect answer. Like I've seen lots of Venn diagrams where I'm just like, is it really though? Uh,
Yeah, I fall into it. Like I don't think I'm very public with it, but I immediately start picking apart other people's answers to this question too. So I'm well aware that mine's going to be picked apart. But ultimately, when I think of, and I think another one to kind of touch on the same spectrum as data analysis or analysts, right?
Mhm.
So, and where I see data scientists are, and when I think about the workload that I want to hand off to a data scientist, it's when I have some empirical data
Mhm.
that you can generate a distribution off of and make an inference about things moving forward. And so it's this idea of, I have some data, or I'm going to go generate this data, right? So I can execute on an experiment that is hypothesis driven. I'm going to generate this data with which I can create a statistical inference from. I think, and I think that's the key there. And like, there can be any number of ways of doing that, from like, hey, here's an average, and I'm going to apply this average moving forward, or
Mhm.
here's the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, 75th percentile. I think those are really valid.
Mhm.
Where I see data engineering coming in is like really in the builder space. So data engineers are there to create repeatable, reliable, robust data pipelines that, again, people can trust to both consume the data from and add data to. So if I think about kind of a number line or just a coordinate space, a data scientist may and hopefully will consume information that is provided by data engineers, generate some sort of model, and then actually produce something for then data engineers to then incorporate into the model for other business users to use. And so it's really around this creation of automated interactionless data processing that that people can rely on, not only being accurate but being there on time and they're the same every day. That's my tiptoeing around. I think I hit all the points that are important. Data analysts, really just to finish that, I kind of mentioned that. I think data analysts
about that. You open the rabbit hole, and I think it's very important because we throw these words around and we rarely differentiate and say what the difference is and what that all means. So yeah. I love that you're diving into it.
Yeah, I think ultimately this role of data analyst is this unsung hero. And it's not this sexy career of 2020 or 2021 or the next decade. When the reality is that largely business is driven off of data analysts and business analysts, right? Data and they do some of this fancy data science, data programming type work that data scientists are doing. I think what differentiates them is that they're going to take historical data, empirical data, and create consumable segmented information that actually makes decisions for the business, right? So you look at the first thing that my salespeople and account managers come in and look at is an analysis of what happened the day before, right? Okay, what new things do we have in the pipeline to look at? How's my revenue look like in the next 6 weeks? And what happened most recently that's affecting my revenue to either go up and down, right? So are we having things start or stop? Are we losing margin somewhere? All these things are an analysis. That's what really professional SQL users are going to be familiar with, and people that are building these consumable analysis products in Looker or Tableau or what have you, or generating them in Python notebooks. It's not relying on the language. I think it's kind of which way are you facing, and I think that data scientist is trying to generate these statistical inferences to move forward, and that data analyst is more operational in today and understanding what happened in the past in order to avoid that in the future. That was kind of and then the data engineering sits underneath all of that, again, back in that coordinate space.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that the kind of forward-looking might be is probably the wrong thing to pigeonhole data science into, but I think definitely
more inference, right? It's you can even look what did cause this.
Yeah.
Okay, we can look at relationships, right? You can think back into college statistics and say, okay, do I have the right difference in between two groups, including their standard error and whatnot.
Exactly. Then you can use that for predictive or prescriptive.
Exactly.
So that's, I think in my humble opinion, I think that's one of the better answers I've heard.
Awesome.
I think usually we forget to talk about, whether it's the analyst or we forget that engineering sits underneath it. I think that's a really common problem where companies will say, we need to hire a bunch of data scientists, and they forget that they have to do the other really time consuming work of data engineering. And I think what you talked about, where it's repeatable, always accurate, perfect every time, always there. We forget how important that is. Because
you only get one failure for everyone to say well, that's not I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in the last 3.5 years that are that's what your data says. But remember 4 months ago when that was wrong, that means that I can't trust it anymore. Pardon me. And it's okay. And
that's a killer.
A lot of times it's hard to fault the person, because if they're going to drive a business on this and you're telling them that their gut is wrong, but my data is right, but they know one time my data was not right. That is a difficult product to sell if you're not on target every time.
Oh yeah, no, and then at that point, then you look for someone else to blame. You're well, the data you gave me is bad.
Exactly.
And then you go down the rabbit hole you end up with, which is
that's a topic for a whole nother podcast, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. That's
blameless organization is a very difficult one to achieve.
Absolutely. But yeah, so I know that you're doing data science now, and well, now you've gone to like the next level, right, of management. But you weren't always a data science person, right? I think you came in from I want to say the hard sciences, if I remember correctly.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I went to college and graduate school for integrative physiology and neuroscience, and I studied. I did like my master's project thesis on in behavioral neuroendocrinology and understanding the interaction between the limbic system, which is an emotional regulating system in your brain, and the physiological responses that come from that, systemically. So not in programming, not in data, right? I had one Python class in my freshman year of college when I was in like the computer engineering major before I switched into a more traditional science. Um, and so yeah, so I imagine the question was going to talk about like how do you get from there to there, because it's not like a direct line of sight transition, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen some folks do it, and it's definitely there is some common stuff, right? I think a lot of folks who kind of come in from that space, if they might be using R to do some sort of reporting or reporting to like some sort of analysis.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of usually where it ends, and then it's a different conversation because you no longer want to. Well, I mean, because of what you're talking about is like hyper academic, super important, like super really
Yeah, arcane, really abstract things, right? That's great. I still talk with my advisor, my mentor from graduate school. I try to at least once a year and talk about how we can collaborate, but very not much, very much in a different situation still, right?
Yeah, well, as someone who also made a total U-turn
Yeah,
after a lot of learning after going to school, I definitely can appreciate it. But yeah, talk me through like what that looked like.
definitely. So for me, it was kind of it served as a life raft because of a pivot that moving away from the concept of going to medical school or getting a PhD, like those are sort of where I was running through when I like got into graduate school. It's like, okay, great, either like medical school or PhD in this, and then decided that medical school was gonna like I didn't have the patience for it necessarily to go through it all. PhD was similar, right? And the job prospect of looking at trying to get an academic research position as like a after one or two postdocs is so daunting. Like I remember my mentor, when he came in, he was like one of 245 applicants, right, for this position, and these positions come up maybe once every few years, at tier one research institutions. So I think the pragmatist in me identified that as something I was not going to be happy necessarily dealing with, or I would thrive more in a situation where I'd have less anxiety about my future ability to support myself.
Yeah.
So I just started looking outside of science, and I didn't actually use those statistical programming languages like R or whatnot in science. Like we used SPSS, and so we did statistical analysis and inference, and I only barely touched into R as I was leaving graduate school. But I really didn't have any of that programming background, even in the sciences. And so I basically just cast a wide net and found a couple of different companies that were willing to give me essentially a chance as like a new hire with just coming in and saying, I learned just enough SQL through books and online to like sort of fake my way through the interview, like and acknowledging that like, hey, I really don't know this. I'm going to answer this problem as best I can. But what I want to sell you on is my ability to learn and my ability, my demonstrable ability to execute on some sort of midterm plan, right? Which was getting through grad school. And so it was really just this concept of not pretending that not pretending that I was going to bring them a ton of value right out of the gate, and acknowledging that maybe in 3 months you're going to want to let me go, and let's call that good. And actually that was like the first company that I really stayed with. That was the deal that we made coming in. They're like, okay, we'll give you 3 months, and then if you're not happy, like we'll send you on the way, and we'll write you a recommendation wherever you want to go, but we're going to have that same out. And I just spent a bunch of time reading and studying, and there's no shortcut, right? I was working all day during the day trying to like with my colleagues at this consulting company, business intelligence consulting, working in like the SQL Server stack to be a little bit more specific before I go high level again. So I picked a specific stack that I was going to be able to understand and become somewhere between proficient and expert in a short period of time. and just read and read and read and studied and studied and studied. So I'd be at work 9 hours a day, but I would then go home and be reading these textbooks around SQL Server until 10 o'clock at night. So there was no, like, there is no shortcut around that, right? And it's just finding, I was lucky enough to be afforded an opportunity to prove that. This was just before this big boom of boot camps and online like MOOC courses that are providing this. And it was like just on the cusp. It was like Coursera was just coming out and it had like classes like environmental ethics and stuff like that. Like those like not quite there. I think right now, and so so I mean, like, long story long, at this point, you get the opportunity and you don't waste it. And I chose to kind of specialize in this, building ETL pipelines using SQL Server and understanding the arcane nomenclature and engine behind like the actual SQL Server engine. So I could sit there and talk to someone about like the exact reason why you'd use one index over the other, or how you could gain this efficiency by changing this one part of this query. So this high performance query tuning. And then I got known as that guy. It's like, okay, well, he just started, but he was able to do this and show proficiency, somewhere between proficiency and expertise in this in a short period of time, and launching into it. And from there, just kind of meandered, right? And so I did this consulting for a while. I switched to another consulting company in Denver, worked with them for a while, ended up working with them remotely for a little while on an independent consulting basis while I started traveling around the world. Left them for a little bit, started working with another company that ultimately hired me to lead their kind of fledgling data engineering practice. And then, after doing that for a period of time, that's when I made that transition more into the business strategy point and really understanding what it meant to monitor performance of something and not just generate the data that allow it. And so I think the kind of underlying thesis on all of that is being flexible around what it is you're doing and how you're doing it, and committing to that learning process and understanding there's no shortcut around it, right? It's just putting in the effort and doing it. And for me, I actually find reading those textbooks now to be easier than doing the online courses. But I think I wish I would have had those online courses when I first started, right? When
both those options, right?
Yeah.
Because like for some people it's easier to read, for some people it's easier to watch. For me, it depends on my mood. I've tried both. I think when you're not ready to like learn and like really put in the work, it's hard. It's hard to do. But when you've got that energy and you're like, I want to do this and I want to learn as well, either way.
Blank slate, and you don't know the things to skip. Like do the online course, watch it at 1x. Now I watch them. And I'll miss something and I'll have to keep rewatching it. Like watch it at 1x, do the thing in the order that they say it is, even if you think you know this one part better already. Like if you're coming in naive to a situation, when I'm learning something new, I do that now. But when I'm learning something like more advanced, then I'm looking for either the textbook on it or like the really jargon laden Medium article. Like so I can go like, okay, I know this. This is the piece I really want to learn.
You want to get the things that you really have. You know the questions you want to ask, and it's like you can kind of skip through some of the stuff. You're like,
exactly.
I've got this. Let me do some pre-reading so I know when I walk in, I have like some stuff that I really want to learn. And then what about for people who I kind of two questions. There are a lot of people who want to break into data, whether it's data science or analytics or whatever. What for them, like what are the things that they should really focus on? Like seeing where you're at now. Like I know it's probably not quite the same thing as like when you got that first role, but you're now able to hire people and you've done your fair share of interviews, I'm sure.
Yeah.
What stands out, and then as a follow-up, for those of us, I'm pointing at myself mostly, who are, you're mostly on the business side. There might be some of your stakeholders, maybe here, maybe your past company, who might be on the marketing side or the product side. They're not trying to become data scientists or even analysts really, but they're like, hey, if I knew a little bit more, like I could be so much better. If I understood what my data scientist did, or I wanted to make a better data-driven decision as a product manager or something. What kinds of things should they learn? So kind of a two-part question. There may be some overlap, but I'll let you take it.
Yeah. It's interesting because I thought about this and coming into here, and I think that there's two ways of approaching it, right? One of them is how do I become a better data-driven business?
Yeah.
And one of them is how do I get into this like data-driven career or culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the latter is the one that I think you just asked me, and what's the best way to do that? And I think understanding that there's no shortcuts, like I mentioned before, like it's this like you've got to put in the effort to learn it.
Yeah.
And then when you're going into those interviews, be transparent about that. Like, hey, my experience is entirely academic coming into this. Here are the projects I've done. I'd like you to ask me about these things. I love coming in and telling people like, ask what should I interview you on? I've done a lot of interviews recently, and I haven't asked that enough. And I'm saying that aloud. I'm thinking back on like these other interviews for some of these consulting companies. Like I'd let them tell me like, hey, tell me what you're best at, and I'll interview you on that. Like that's what I want to know. And if you can get someone to interview you about the things you know, what they'll see is that you failed. You understand the pitfalls. You really understand the mature way to answer a question, not the cookie cutter way of answering it. Right? It's like, well, there's doing this, but like, yeah, that works 5 times out of 10, and it's a little more complicated. Maybe it's 100% accurate, but if you do this other thing, maybe it's 80% accurate and works 10 questions that you're best at and that you want to answer. I think is great. Being transparent that, hey, my background is taking data camp courses. My background is through these few GitHub projects. Here's what I've done. Here's my skill level. Like, right, just putting it out there so that there's no, mistake around it.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of that getting into it.
Yeah.
And obviously finding like entry levels like slapped on the front of a job title, because then they're expecting that and they want to do this, right?
Yeah.
I think that's really a great way to gain credibility with your interviewer, is just saying, hey, here's what it is.
Yeah. Here's what it is, and kind of directing the conversation towards stuff that you have like domain knowledge in, and you can actually like authentically talk about it without like you don't sound like you don't know, you're not like trying to sound like create the perfect answer, because those sound cheesy, and like like my favorite question, and you've kind of touched on it, for people who you've interviewed, I don't know how many people, but lots, right? Like what are the things that like now, and for me the fun part is you after you do that, you start to realize all the terrible answers you used to give when you first started your jobs.
Exactly.
But also it's kind of like looking at like what, like when you're talking to someone, or even when you're looking at a resume, like what stands out to you? Like when you have like a stack of 100 and you're just like going through, if you're looking at like someone who's like coming in kind of like in a junior role, what are you like, it's normal, this is normal, like, but you're like, oh, this is interesting, let me talk to this person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's highlighting like the pieces on your resume that speak most directly to the things that are on the job description, right? So if I want someone to come in and be fluent in SQL and understand how to model data for a business intelligence like consumption, right? So like this idea of like canonical data modeling and bringing a bunch of sources together. If you're highlighting, Scala as your language of choice, probably not going to work in my environment, right? Because my environment is a SQL-based environment for this use case.
So you do the research, do your homework, as like a first step.
Yeah, just like right, understanding there's not one resume for the job for that speaks to you, right? Making a resume that's you can kind of move around in a way that highlights different components. I think that's the biggest thing, is that here's what I do. Coincidentally, it's what you're looking for. I think that shows that you've done your research. And here's a spiel about me. Like for me, like my resume says something like, as a research scientist and professional, data analytics professional, I know how to answer questions, through hypothesis-driven tested and repeatable and reliable, robust data engineering frameworks. Like I think that's like sentence number 1 on my resume. And I think that speaks to it. It's like, one, that speaks to me. The next component is going to be like the kind of two different things that highlight that.
Mm-hmm.
But then the next part of that on my resume is a skill, like just a technical skills section, right? And so it says like those I can move around really easily. So if someone's looking for SQL and Microsoft SQL Server, guess what? Those things, like I think those end up on the end of my skills list, kind of in my generic one.
Yeah.
They get moved right to the front, you know. And then I can move, then I go through and say I've done these positions and highlight the skills that I put at the top for each one of those positions. So that more chronological, but you can then scroll to Patrick says he's done data warehousing and SQL Server and blah blah blah. You can go right to the point on my resume that uses those skills and understand what I was doing with those skill sets in that position. Obviously, if you're breaking into the role, more difficult. But kind of like that's kind of like my thesis behind like a resume writing, right? Is like tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them again, right? It's kind of like kind of speech delivery.
And then kind of play to your strengths and push what they're looking for. Obviously, don't lie, right? It's important to because like for me, the thing that I always find, I'm sure I did it when I was first coming out of undergrad, didn't know what to do. I'm like, oh yeah, everyone knows Excel, right? Put it on there. But then like the number of times I talked to someone who said they knew pivot tables, and then you flip your computer screen around and say, hey, do one for me. And then they don't even know like where the button is, what to look for. And it's
or like what value it's adding, like any one of those things, right?
Yeah, and just any of those questions, like, it's like maybe you don't know what button to look for because you use a different version of Excel. Like, that's okay, right? But it's like, if you're just like, well, what's that? I'm like, okay, well, maybe you should put that on your resume. But point well taken, I think, and really just, of course, like playing to your strengths, but also like modifying based on like, don't just send something super generic out, and then breaking in, I think, is more of your point. I mean, to me, it's very much diving in, remembering that there is a lot of work. Like there's no, like, you're not going to take a class that's like 10 hours long and pretend you're a data scientist. It's like you're doing all kinds of work. But also, I think there is like a strategic element to it when you're looking to like learn stuff. I think I love when you talked about like being really good at that one thing and then stacking on top of that.
Yeah, I've got that kind of as a point I wanted to bring up here as well. Is like become an opinionated architect, but allow yourself to have a strong sense of humility, right? So come in and know that this is the way I do things, and this is why, and know that you're gonna be wrong with some at some level of frequency, right?
Yeah, you're wrong many times.
Yeah, right. And I come in like I always know the way I want to do something, and that's not always what's going to work with a specific situation, and so. Knowing what's in your toolbox, knowing like the arsenal you have to solve a problem, even if you're entry level, right? Yeah. This is even for those people that have never had a job in data science at all. Know that your toolbox is Python and Pandas and sklearn, and anything else you're not going to recommend, but maybe what they're using is R embedded in SQL Server and those packages, and say, great, listen, here are the things that I know work with that. They're not working in your environment, but like there's analogs. There's always an analog, right? I think what that highlights is how like it highlights how important process is, but allows you to focus on the cool thing, which is technology, right? Yeah. So like, okay, this is my opinion, not going to work. Great. Let's see what does. Let's do that.
Yeah, no, I think what you're talking about really is the ability to learn, like learning how to learn, which sounds kind of crazy, right? But ultimately it's like you can teach someone to code. You can teach someone domain knowledge after a while. You can teach someone something specific. What you can't teach them to do is to problem solve. That's a little bit harder, right? Someone has to actually like go through it. If you can show that you can problem solve and you can show that you can learn what I'm teaching you, that makes it a lot easier. And what you're talking about, it's like I might have, Python and Pandas and whatever, and then that next step, it's like, hey, I don't know this, but to your point, there are analogs, and then there's lots of Google.
And finding right. Don't go work for like, and this is not to hate on 10-person startups that they're the ones that change the world. But like if you're breaking in, go try to work on a data science team. Find a mentor that you can learn from. I think it took me a little bit to identify this later on down in my career, but I had two good mentors at my first two jobs that like informed me so much. Like I still emulate a lot of the processes that they did, and learn from them. Like, great, there's this, there's 10 different ways of doing it, and here's the one that makes most sense and is most readable and is most debuggable and all these things that make code good code.
Yeah.
You learn that more from the person that is in charge, is doing it right, than looking at it in a book. Because like when I read these, like how people are writing code, immediately I'm like, well, I can do this way. This looks more readable to me. And you generate this what works for me view. Experienced leaders in this space know what works for the larger group, right? And understanding that the things that you think are important are not the only important things.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're preaching to the choir. That's like me on my soapbox. That's why all of our teachers are all practitioners, because to your point, you can read a book, but I want someone who's done it before and like messed it all up. Like they know what actually works, right? Because shit breaks, stuff happens. Like it's important that you can come back from that. You know how to analyze that, say, okay, well, this happened. Let's not do that again, but let's figure out why and come back to it. But
and you can trust the criticism, right? Like they're going to look at they're going to look at your work and criticize it, and that's something you can trust. Like a book can't criticize your work, even if it compiles correctly, right? Or a course.
Exactly. And I mean, criticism ultimately is what you're looking for. You want someone who can show you, like, how do you fix it so that you actually get it right? And I couldn't agree with you more on finding good mentors. It's hard to understand what that means when you're especially breaking in. But even now, it's like, I've had some similar experiences looking back. I didn't understand at the time I was being mentored, at least not initially.
Yeah, same. Absolutely. Same thing.
And then looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, that's how like I became like, for me, it was crazy. I was working at a law firm, and I was like, I became the only other person in like this 100-person office that could use Excel proficiently.
Yeah.
Like the basic pivot tables. Like, how ridiculous is that?
Right. And all of a sudden, this value that you bring by paying attention to those things, that those people that are sometimes your mentors in disguise, right? That are like that knew were important.
Exactly. And then you realize that you're like, oh man, I had this one boss that was really amazing, who I learned a lot from. It's like, once you find that person, stick with them if you can. But yeah, and I think the last thing that you mentioned, I think, is super important, is like kind of what we tell people to do is like, you can read and you can follow along and you can do like the exercises, right, that come from a book or your online course or whatever. But like, to me, it's like where you learn the most is take that, go put it on your project, whatever you're working, whatever you're learning on, mess it all up, because then you can actually, because like then you're going to know, hey, am I doing this right? Or I messed up somewhere. Let me go figure out where. And the act of like going through that work, it's more work. It's learning the hard way to an extent.
Yep.
But going through that effort, you get so much better the second time and then the third time.
Yeah, and you gain, like you get that tougher skin, and you get like, you understand where it makes sense to take risks and where it makes less sense to take risks, right? Like, I think that's, as I see my maturity grow in this space, specifically, is around that, where it's like, okay, it's a high percentage decision or low percentage decision. Do I care about this extra couple percentage points of accuracy, or would I rather have this order of magnitude of reliability? And so those things were the coolest thing to do is not necessarily the right thing, and understanding the repercussions of those decisions.
Yeah, and that is a rabbit hole. That would be an entirely new podcast, but I would happily get into that next time. But I think we're gonna call it good here.
Cool.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Aaron.
Sorry for cutting you off. For everyone who's watching, please drop us a like and a follow. And then definitely be on the lookout for our emails if you want to attend these kinds of conversations live and ask questions of these top practitioners. With that said, thanks for coming. Obviously, this is a podcast, but thanks for listening. And then hope to see you next time. Bye.
Take care.